Good evening. Welcome to our Zoom forum, What's Wrong with Prolonged Solitary Confinement, presented by the Episcopal Diocese of Pittsburgh Social Justice and Outreach Committee and the Commission on Race and Reconciliation. I'm Marianne Novi, chair of the Social Justice and Outreach Committee. So that everyone knows, here are the guidelines. Everyone is muted except our speaker and will remain muted. Please put your questions in chat. We are recording. If you would like to remain anonymous, use the rename function. As you all know, tomorrow is the Pennsylvania primary election. Tuesday, right? Sorry.
Tuesday, correct. It's almost tomorrow, but
yes, okay. Tuesday is the Pennsylvania primary election, and there is a question on the ballot proposing a change in the rules about solitary confinement at the Allegheny County Jail. Many people who oppose the way solitary confinement is practiced there frequently and prolonged sign petitions to put the change of rules on the ballot. We are very fortunate to have with us tonight Professor Jules Lebel, one of the leading experts nationally on what is wrong with prolonged solitary confinement. Professor Lebel, the former head of the Center for Constitutional Rights, holds the Bessie McKee Walther Endowed Chair at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Representing prisoners has been a lifetime calling for him. He has taught courses on solitary confinement, co-edited a recent book on it, and in a major class action suit, convinced the United States Supreme Court that prisoners in prolonged solitary are entitled to due process. Thank you for being with us, Professor Lebel.
Well, thank you for asking me to do this. It's my privilege and honor to do it. It's an incredibly important issue. As Marianne said, I've been working on this issue, not my whole life, but certainly at a very intense level for the last 20 years. And I was one of the lawyers behind bringing the case challenging the use of solitary confinement in Allegheny County Jail, a case which is now pending and which is tied to the referendum. When I went back and I looked at the title for this, What's Wrong with Prolonged Solitary Confinement? The answer to that question seems to me both obvious and very complicated. The obvious answer, and this is what I've argued to numerous courts, because in addition to the Supreme Court argument, I represented thousands of prisoners in California who were subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, and we won that case. But when I argued to courts and when I think about this question, it seems like the best answer to that, and the answer which will get us all to other things in about 1 minute, is it seems obvious that to put somebody in a small cell, in some cases not larger than a medium-sized walk-in closet in an average American apartment or house, in a small cell, 23 hours a day, often, or in many cases without windows, like in Pelican Bay, often without access to phone calls, almost never without access to contact with any other individuals. Physical touch is prohibited. And if I describe the conditions at Pelican Bay, where thousands of people spent years in solitary confinement, I think it should be obvious. I mean, here, people were locked in an 8x10 cell. As I said, there was no window, so people who were so locked in never got to see birds, trees, other people. They were able to go out 1 hour a day to their cell, to a larger cell, where they got no sunlight. The only fresh air was the fact that the roof of this cell was outside and therefore was graded. and there were 15 feet high walls. So if they got out at a particular time, they got a little sunlight. Otherwise, they got no sunlight, no fresh air. They had no phone calls, no contact visits with family or friends, no programming whatsoever. So when I explain this to a judge or to my doctor or to individuals that I meet, it seems to me that most people say this is inhumane to put people in this kind of situation. It seems obvious that it's going to be harmful to people, that it's inhumane, and that we as a civilized society will look back at this 100 years from now and say, how could we have possibly considered this to be a valid penological approach to dealing with prisoners? It just seems on its face inhumane. And, you know, when you do a legal case or when you discuss the law, or you discuss what's wrong with prolonged solitary confinement, we often get into a lot of expert opinions. We get into a lot of technical science, a lot of technical penological expertise. But it seems like the basic problem is when you look at this, as Justice Stewart once said about pornography, you know it when you see it. This is inhumane. And any thinking human being should say, this cannot be the way we treat other human beings. That seems to me the basic answer. And that's a 1 or 2 minute answer that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights prohibits cruel and inhumane treatment. This is on its face inhumane. Just describing it is inhumane. The US Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and this on its face is cruel. I just don't see any other way around it. And my tact in these cases has been to try to convince judges of what common sense and basic humanity ought to teach us. And that's how I would talk to people on the street about this, that this just does not seem to be a way that civilized people, civilized society should treat other people, no matter what they've done. And you know, when we brought the case in California, we did both videos of people who were confined in solitary confinement, which is a whole nother story of how we were able to do that. And we also took their testimony, even before we filed the case. And one of my clients, Gabriel Reyes, said, you know, I've committed a crime. I accept that I should be punished for it, but I shouldn't be treated inhumanely. And this is just inhumane. So that's the 2 minute short version answer, which I think is the fundamental answer to it. And I think that's how people should think about basic questions like slavery, torture, solitary confinement. You know, that this is, we have to get better than this. We have to go beyond this. And unfortunately, in our age, many people have not been able to see it, but hopefully some point in the future, we'll look back at this and say, how could we do this? Okay, that's my basic answer. The problem with that answer is that until the last few years, the courts have generally affirmed the use of solitary confinement. And the history in this country is abysmal in this way, that solitary confinement was first really invented on a mass scale in Pennsylvania. The Quakers, for all the good things that the Quakers brought us, also brought us the concept of solitary confinement. And its original concept, as used in Easton Penitentiary and a couple of major penitentiaries in Pennsylvania, was that if you've done something bad, you have to repent your sins. And the best way to do that is to think about that over and over by yourself. And if you spent some years in solitary, it would allow you to ponder what you've done and become a better person. That was the theory. Charles Dickens, when the famous writer, when he visited that penitentiary, said, despite their theory, what this does is it makes people crazy, drives people crazy. And Alexis de Tocqueville, another great European sociologist who visited the United States, went all around the country. When he visited this prison said, this just drives people crazy. And eventually, the US Supreme Court in the 1890s agreed with that and said, not in a case that raised the issue of solitary confinement, but in a death penalty case, where prior to giving somebody the death penalty, they put him in solitary confinement, the court said, this is an impermissible punishment. And solitary in a mass way faded from the American scene. Every once in a while it was used in a prison, but just every once in a while, infrequently. Even the most draconian prison in the United States, which you are now able to visit. If you go to San Francisco and you visit Alcatraz, which held the most hardened, dangerous criminals in the United States, were not solitary. They were put on an island so that they had to swim to escape. It was almost impossible. And they were isolated in large part from their families, but they were given work and they were able to have a collective prison experience, even at Alcatraz. What changed? The situation in the United States started to change in the 1970s and 80s. And I've argued that what changed it was the same thing, the same exact forces that led to the rise of mass incarceration. Mass solitary confinement cannot be treated in isolation from the rise of mass incarceration because they're two of the same phenomena. Now, what prison officials will tell you is the same thing that politicians told you about mass incarceration, which is that in the 1960s and 70s, prisons became more violent. Because they became more violent, they had to figure out ways to squash or control this violence. And the way they came up with, first at Marion, which was the most draconian prison in the United States, federal prison, and then copied in dozens of state prisons, was to develop standalone supermax prisons for the most dangerous people in each system, to put them away, keep them out of the general population, and therefore tamp down on prison violence. And it's the same general policy in a way that you could say with mass incarceration, that the way politicians saw of dealing with rising crime was to create more and more prisons, put people, lock them away out of sight, figuring that that'll keep the rest of the society safe. In the prison context, you isolate, separate dangerous prisoners, and you will keep everybody else safe. Now, in fact, both for mass incarceration, if you've read the work of Michelle Alexander, and for solitary, if you've read my work, which I doubt you have, but so be it. That's not really what happened. And I know what happened in the prison context very well. What happened in the prison context was the 1960s and 70s, was an era in prisons of political agitation and prison revolts over political conditions. Attica, other prison protests. In fact, in Marion, you had a major labor protest. Workers, the prison workforce went out on strike. And the way that the prison authorities responded to the lack of control, their loss of control, both I think in society in general, with the civil rights movement, and in the corresponding upsurge in prisons, was to attempt to reassert control. And the answer to that was solitary confinement. So by 2000, you had 100,000 people in American prisons in long-term solitary confinement, from a very small number in 1960. And I think this was a response to the political upsurge in prisons and in society. So I think the first thing in understanding what's wrong with solitary confinement, apart from the basic inhumanity of it, is that its adoption and its continued use was not so much a response to problems in the prison, but to the prison officials seeking to reassert control. And that raises a host of other questions. The next thing I want to say is that to prove to a court, and maybe to prove to people on the street, that solitary confinement is wrong, requires more than just basic humanity. Because a court wants to know, what's the expert analysis of this? The first thing that's happened in the last 20 years, which has now begun to influence the courts, is that psychologists have shown that solitary confinement, as Dickens saw in the 1830s, has a dramatic effect on people's mind and tends to drive them crazy. I ask people, if I describe to you the Pelican Bay situation, if I put you in a small cell, 23 hours a day, no contact with other people, how long do you think you could take it before going crazy? And I often try to close my eyes and imagine how long I could do it for. I think I might last a week if I really was strong. And then after a week, I'd start going batty. A good friend of mine who was the director of prisons in Colorado, which had thousands of people in solitary confinement, he did an experiment. He went into a solitary cell for one night, for a day and a night. He went for 24 hours. He started at 2 p.m. and he said, let's see how long I could take this. And by about 7 the next morning, he'd had enough and he couldn't do it anymore. And at that point, he got convinced that he had to get rid of solitary confinement in Colorado, which he was successful in doing. So I think people need social interaction. People need environmental stimulus. And without that, many people go crazy. Now, this is particularly true, and this is the situation which really has affected us in Allegheny County and in jails around the country. It's particularly true for people with mental illness. Now, if you look at Allegheny County Jail, which, by the way, is unbelievably disproportionately populated with African Americans. The African American population in our county, I think, is about 14%. When we brought our case, we put in our case and showed that 63% of all the people in Allegheny County Jail are African American. And many of the people in Allegheny County Jail have mental problems of one sort or another. And 30 years ago, they would have been put in some mental institution, which would have been terrible. Because of the reforms of mental institutions, basically shutting down these big, awful mental hospitals, the problem has been foisted now on jails and prisons. So you get a lot of people with mental problems, either serious mental illness or just mental problems, get thrown into Allegheny County Jail. Once they get into jail, what happens? They're in an oppressive situation. They tend to act up, even if they're there for a very minor crime, even if they're there for a parole violation. And we had a plaintiff whose parole violation is that she didn't report on time to her parole officer. And because she didn't report on time to her parole officer, she went to Allegheny County Jail for months. Now, once that happens, the next thing that happens is you start acting out. You start doing things that reflect the fact that you're really angry and pissed off about this situation. And then how does the jail respond? they throw you in solitary confinement. And what happens to a lot of these people? What happens to a lot of these people, a higher percentage than just regular jail detainees, is they begin to attempt suicide, commit suicide. And so one thing that's wrong with prolonged solitary confinement is that when imposed on people who have some kind of mental disorder, it leads to a high rate of either suicide attempts, self-infliction of harm, or actual suicide. And the Abolitionist Law Center and myself in particular just won a case a few months ago for the suicide of a young kid, 22 years old, who was in jail for some, not major crime, but it was in prison. They put him in, they knew he had mental illness. They put him in solitary confinement. They repeatedly put him in solitary confinement. Eventually, he killed himself. And we just won a big settlement for his family from Pennsylvania. This happened in Pennsylvania. And it's because right now, throughout the country, there's a growing recognition that for vulnerable populations, juveniles, pregnant women, people with disabilities, people with mental illness, to put them in solitary confinement is, in the words of a famous judge in California, like putting an asthmatic in a smoke-filled room. And that is to a large degree, how it's used in Allegheny County. If you look at the referendum before us, a critical problem in Allegheny County is the use of solitary confinement against people with mental illness. And that is on its way out. We're winning on that issue. And, they're in Pennsylvania, in the state prisons in Pennsylvania, under a federal investigation under the Obama administration, Pennsylvania agreed finally to not use solitary confinement against people with mental illness. But that has not affected the dozens of jails in counties around Pennsylvania, like Philadelphia or Allegheny County. And the Abolitionist Law Center is starting to do something about this. And this referendum will conclusively do something about it. So that's another thing. When I say what's wrong with it, I've now listed three things. One is it's just inhumane. We should be able to decently see that. Second is that it's used not really as a method of just controlling violence, but as a method of controlling prisons. It's an easy fix to control prisons, prevent prisoners from organizing against corrupt prison administrations. And as that, it's a wrong thing to use. Third, when used against people with mental illness, it causes self-injury, attempted suicide, and suicide. So that leaves, and that, by the way, if you just got rid of that type of solitary confinement, use in many cases for petty reasons, most of the examples that I gave are not people who have committed murders or some heinous, they're not the Hannibal Lecters of the world. They're people who commit some petty infraction, but they're put in solitary confinement. If you got rid of all of that, that would get rid of a significant percentage of solitary confinement. But it wouldn't satisfy me because I think the whole practice is horrendous from beginning to end. What about, and this was the case in California, this is what we confronted. What about people who are in solitary confinement, who don't have mental illness, who are not going crazy? What about them? What's the harm that it occasions to people who are in that situation? And that was the clients we had in California. And to me, it's remarkable. I said I could probably maybe survive a week, maybe. I had clients in California who were in solitary confinement for 20 years. How could you possibly survive 20 years? And what's the damage that it would do to you? We had a client in Pennsylvania who had been locked up in solitary confinement for 35 years. And he came and he testified on the stand, and the state's main argument was, look, he seems to function normally. He's not crazy. He's not smearing feces on the wall. He's not beating himself. He's not harming himself. He talks rationally. He walked out to the courtroom, reasonably. He walked as if he had handcuffs on, even though he didn't, because he was so used to walking that way. But he presented as a sane, rational, reasonable person. And so you say in that situation, the question you've asked me is, what's the harm? What's the harm? And actually, if this was a law school class, what I would do is ask you, because that's the way we teach in law school. What do you think the harm is? It's one thing to say you put mentally ill people there and there's a high risk of suicide. It's another thing to say you put people there who shouldn't be in solitary confinement. They're there for political reasons. But what about the people who have committed serious offenses and where they're in solitary confinement and they seemingly have adjusted to it? What's the harm then? Now, I'm not teaching a law school class, so I'm going to tell you. But I want you to, that's the problem. We face two major problems in this area in eliminating solitary confinement. We are winning in the courts and in public opinion in reducing solitary confinement. But my goal is to abolish it totally. And the two problems are, what about the people who seem to be able to adjust to it, which is thousands of people? It's unbelievable that they can do this. But what about them? And number one, and number two, what's the alternative for the really dangerous prisoners? That's where the prison officials say, you have this guy who's a very violent person. You put him in the general population, he's going to kill somebody. If you want us to do that, we're responsible for everybody in the prison. So those are the two main problems. And on the first problem, I'll tell you what we did in California. We brought in 6 or 7 key experts, scientific experts. So in the law, what you try to do is you try to back up the humane position, the common sense position, with scientific expertise. We had 2 psychologists, one an academic psychologist, the other a psychiatrist. And they testified, they presented evidence that, somehow my video has been spotlighted for everybody.
I forgot to do that earlier.
Okay, did it change everybody's viewing of me? Okay, well, it changed my viewing of me. It was kind of disconcerting, but that's fine. So there's a couple of things. One is that even when people present as normal, years and years of solitary confinement eats away at your psyche. And eventually, even if you steel yourself to the fact that I'm going to continue day by day, I'm not going to commit suicide, it begins to affect you. And even for those people, there became a very significant risk that when they lose hope, they would just go crazy. So that's the first thing. Even when it appears to have no effect, it really does. The second thing was that what solitary confinement for these people showed was really the powers of the human psyche to adapt to terrible conditions. Viktor Frankl wrote about Auschwitz and how some people were able to survive in Auschwitz and what they did. And many of my clients, when I asked them how did you survive, they said either by humor, by learning the law. I can't tell you how many clients who were almost as good a lawyer as I was, some of whom were better. They really studied the law, and it was their way of keeping sane. Many artists. So people had to develop some way of keeping their mind active, and they were able to do that. Now, this didn't mean that they didn't have terrible psychological problems. And as these psychiatrists testified, even people who appeared normal had psychosis, had anger management problems, had eyesight problems. They had all kinds of psychological depression, anxiety, paranoia, seeing things, but they managed to function. And so for those people who were functional, one of the things that was developed by these psychiatrists in terms of expertise is that their power of adaptation was to isolate themselves totally from the outside world. And what they called it was a social death. You have a physical death, you might have a spiritual death, but this was a social death. And the social death was when you were placed in this situation for this long a time, you just lost any contact and lost any interest even in the world outside of you. And that created the adaptation to this created tremendous psychological problems in itself. So we had psychological evidence that even the people who were able, that many people can adapt to it, particularly people who are vulnerable, and they go crazy or they become suicidal. But even those people who don't still suffered tremendous psychological problems. We wanted to go further though. And what we tried to do is to show, and I think we have successfully done it, is to show that this also causes physical problems. Solitary confinement does not only mess with your mind. And this is very important for all of you folks, particularly the folks like me, who are over 60 years old or so. There have been innumerable studies showing that for people in general, but particularly the elderly, social isolation is as big a risk factor for heart disease and stroke as is smoking and obesity. And as you probably know, those are serious risk factors. And they did studies of 100,000 people in different cities, in London and Chicago. And in each of them, they showed that there was a much higher level of heart disease, strokes, for people, hypertension, for people in similar situations, depending on whether they were socially isolated or not. And as I said, the risk factor was as high as smoking or obesity. When we took that and transferred it into the prison, we came with the same risk, that social isolation is not just a psychological problem, but it leads to hypertension, leads to heart disease on a much higher level. So if you ask what's wrong with prolonged solitary confinement, it is really bad for your health. It's bad for your health if you do it voluntarily, or if you lose contact with friends and family, but it's particularly bad for your health if you're involuntarily put into a position where you have no social contact. The same thing, we had an expert on touch. Most people in solitary confinement do not get contact visits. I had clients who for 20 years had never touched another person in a meaningful way, except for a little push by the police, the correctional officials to move on your way. And that, again, if you look at scientific evidence, it causes problems for your health. Finally, we had neuroscience testify, and there is no question that solitary confinement affects the way your brain works. And it has long-term, we haven't been able to do scientific studies on this because it's all in prisons. But the neuroscientists say from a theoretical perspective, we are social beings. And if you remove the social context from our psyche, it affects the way our brain operates. So that's the physical, psychological, neurological things that make solitary wrong. Finally, I want to get to the penological. And this gets to our second question. What's the alternative? You know, you get, I don't know how many of you have seen Silence of the Lambs. You get a Hannibal Lecter character who's a pathological killer. And the prison officials say, what are we going to do? You know, this is a hard job, and that's what the courts have deferred to. The courts have said, well, prison officials have a hard job. They get these pathological killers. What are they going to do? Now, as I say, most of the people in solitary confinement are not the Hannibal Lecters. The Hannibal Lecters are very few. So if you got rid of almost all those people that shouldn't be in solitary confinement under any circumstance, and then you dealt with the few who really are very dangerous, then what I think the answer is, as we had an expert testify they developed in England and Norway as an answer, is that you have to segregate those people from the general population, but you don't have to treat them inhumanely. There is no reason why you can't, even in a separate situation, allow them to have social contact with their families, allow them to have social contact with prison officials, maybe in very limited circumstances, social contact with other prisoners, and work on a program eventually to help them get out of their state. But even if they can't, there's no reason to lock them up 23 hours a day in a cell with no programming, with no education, with no phone calls. There is no reason in Pelican Bay that they couldn't have these people have daily phone calls with their family. There was no penological reason for that. The only reason was to say this is going to be more horrendous punishment. If you act this way, we're going to super punish you. And what you have to do is extricate the prevention rationale from the punitive rationale. You could prevent violence without these draconian methods. To end, one of my most profound experiences was visiting Norway. The Norwegian prison system operates on a whole different philosophy than us, and they don't use solitary confinement except in extreme cases. And even in those cases, as I said, they try to get social interaction. I visited the main maximum security prison in Norway, and they had all sorts of programming. They had the architecture of the thing was that a lot of people had a lot of open green space. They couldn't get out of prison because there were high walls with barbed wire, but once they were in the prison, it wasn't built as a draconian castle. It was built as a green area where they would try to replicate what the outside environment was like. And Norway has the view that people who are in prison are people who have done bad acts for which they have been sent to prison, but they are not necessarily people who are bad people. In our prisons, we treat people who are in prison as bad people and not people who have just done bad acts. And that's a fundamental different philosophy. And once you start from the philosophy that these are people who've gone and done something bad, you try to help them. Once you start from the philosophy that these are bad people, you just try to warehouse them. And that's what's happening in our prisons. So thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you've not enjoyed, but I hope you learned something from this talk, and I'm happy to take what any questions or comments you have.
Thank you very much. This was indeed very informative, and there are a few questions in the chat, and I would encourage other people to put their questions in the chat to be passed on. First, I wondered if you could say something about the population of the Allegheny County Jail in particular. You feel that this is bad for everyone, but are there things about the Allegheny County Jail inmates that make it even more unjust in some ways?
Yeah, I think that there's a significant percentage of the people in Allegheny County jail who don't need criminal punishment at all, but need mental health help. Drug problems, all kinds of mental health issues, and economic issues. And there are two things that the solitary thing is related to. One is that these people shouldn't be in prison at all. It's an outrage that we, for those of you who remember this, the old Allegheny County Jail was abysmal, and there was a lawsuit brought against it, and they were forced to build a new Allegheny County Jail to prevent the overcrowding. And as they say in Field of Dreams, if you build them, they will come. And so now they filled out that jail. And I think the first key point that we should be all concerned about is reducing the number of people who go to Allegheny County Jail and finding alternative methods of dealing with people, particularly people who have parole violations. I mean, it's one thing if you have a parole violation and you killed somebody while on parole. It's another thing if you had some technical parole violation, and there are judges in Allegheny County who just send people routinely to prison or to the jail for minor parole violations. And that has to end. A lot of the people who are habitually sent to Allegheny County Jail for minor crimes are people with mental problems, and they wind up in solitary confinement. And I think our society has to find a better way of dealing with those people. And once they come to the jail, you can't deal with them by just throwing them in solitary confinement. So a lot of the people in Allegheny County Jail, in my view, shouldn't be there. A lot of the people have some mental issues that they're dealing with. And we as a society should figure out how to keep those people out of jail. And once they get to jail, treat them humanely. And by the way, most people in Allegheny County Jail are just awaiting trial. They haven't been convicted of anything. A percentage have been convicted and are waiting to transfer, but a small percentage. The overwhelming majority of people in Allegheny County Jail are there for detention purposes and not because they've been convicted of a crime. And I hope that this solitary confinement petition referendum will lead to these deeper questions about what's going on at the jail and what's going on in our criminal justice system. And on the ballot, we also have a slate of judges. There's a election for common pleas judge, the Court of Common Pleas judge, and there are 9 openings, which is very unusual. So I'm not going to give you candidates, but I highly suggest that you look at the candidates who are running and try to find out something about them and educate each other about them. Because if we get people who don't routinely just send people to jail as judges, that would be a major step forward. Okay, I'm sorry, that took a long time.
Yeah, well, that's all important things. Another question that came up is, you spoke of some prisoners who had educated themselves or become artists during their time in jail. In the Allegheny County Jail, do people have access to books or electronics? And do they have lights that are on all the time, or are the lights off at night?
Yeah, I think for most of them, the lights are off at night. They do have access to books. the programming is very weak. You know, it's not a rehabilitative place. The programming is very weak, but you know, but for the serious problems in the jail, like the use of force, the inability to give medication, to give psychiatric treatment, the jail is not equipped to do this kind of thing. That's what's really needed. But people do have access to books. You know, there are some people in Allegheny County Jail who have educated themselves. People who mostly I know of are people who spent many years in prison, like the executive director of the Abolitionist Law Center. I see there's a question, or how often are punitive measures based on assumed good practices versus practices that have been studied and proven? From Brian. I think that's a great question. And it gets to the heart of solitary confinement. Nobody really studied or proved that solitary confinement works. It's always been assumed that the best way to deal with somebody who's dangerous is to totally isolate them. In fact, the studies that have been shown show that it doesn't work. This is actually not good prison practices. And there have been studies on that if you treat people like this, they just get angrier and angrier. And most people who are in solitary confinement get out into society, get back into society. Most people go to Allegheny County Jail who are in solitary confinement are going to be among us in another year or 2 or 3 years. And their anger level is going to increase dramatically because of the experience they had in jail. And is that harming or hurting public safety? And the reason that the Colorado director was eventually convinced to end solitary confinement was primarily penological. He believed that this method is designed to make people to endanger the public safety, because it's just making people angry and more psychotic, more frustrated. And therefore, if you're really interested in public safety, you wouldn't do this. So thank you for that question, Brian. Let's see.
Can people sue for damages when they are out of prison? Damages that they endured because of solitary confinement?
Yeah, we have sued, the Abolitionist Law Center has sued for damages. One of the problems which is now being overcome today, I mean, in this last year or 2, is that the courts, and this is a problem generally for damaged civil rights actions, the courts have held that even if your constitutional rights have been violated, you're not entitled to damages unless the violation was absolutely clear at the time that the police officer or the correctional official violated your rights. So it's not enough to just prove your rights were violated. You have to show that they knew about it or that it was clear. And for solitary confinement until recently, that wasn't clear. Now I think it's become clear, at least for mentally ill people, that you put mentally ill people in solitary, that's a constitutional violation. And I think that now it's possible for those people to sue for damages. I think this referendum is probably one of the most effective ways for members of the public to work against solitary confinement. But I also think to write legislators, donate funds to groups that are working on solitary confinement, all of those are very useful tools to work against it. The last question that I'll respond to was, I think, I forget who asked it, but maybe you, Marianne. But to talk a little bit about how people are educated while in solitary confinement. And I've represented a number of clients, as I said, who somehow channel their anger. Many people who are in solitary confinement channel their anger into really bad thoughts, paranoia, narcissism, retribution, or just going psychotic. But there are a handful of people, more than a handful, there are a significant number of people who channel it and say, the only thing I'm going to do to remain sane is to read everything I can about the law and fight these people using legal means. And I had a client, I'll just give you one example, and a guy named Eduardo Dombricki, who, when we brought the suit in California, wrote me a 30-page memorandum and said, these are the claims that you should be bringing. And you have brought some of them, but one or two of them you haven't brought. And I want you to think about this. My first response as a lawyer was to say, well, what is this prisoner who has a high school education? He had a GED. What's he going to tell me? And I litigated this issue up to the Supreme Court, and it was on due process. I don't think he has much of a claim here. But then I thought about it, and I got my research assistant to do some research about it. And it turned out that he had a very good idea. And I told the legal team, we should incorporate this. We incorporated it, and 5 years later, his legal theory carried the day. That he raised, not we. He was a better lawyer than we were. And just 2 months ago, he spent 8 or 9 years in solitary confinement. He spent 24 years in prison for a crime he committed when he was 17. A murder not that he committed, a murder he was accused of and convicted of. And just 2 months ago, I got a call from him on a beach in California. And he said, Professor, you'll never guess what happened. I just was freed. The court found that I was innocent,
Wow.
and he had been fighting his case all along, and that not only was he innocent because the real murderer stepped forward, but the prosecuting attorney had withheld information. And so now a very famous attorney is suing for damages. But he, to me, represented how people can overcome this evil, terrible thing that's happened to them, and it not allow them to crush their spirit and become excellent lawyers. He wants to go to law school. I'd like to get him into Pitt eventually.
Well, thank you very much, Professor LaBelle. This has really been very, very enlightening. And I'd also like to thank Brian Webb and Julie Smith for their background work on this.
And thank you all for attending, and it's my pleasure.
Right.
Sorry, as a professor, I have the unfortunate professional trait of going on and on and on. So I apologize for that, but I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you so much.
It seemed to be perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Keep up your good work.
Oh, yeah. And you too also.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, okay.